Let me ask you something. What if the very soil you have been told is bad, the dry patches, the rocky ground, the tired backyard dirt, was actually capable of growing food that could feed your family for years? What if I told you that some of the most resilient fruit trees on this earth do not just survive in poor soil, they quietly thrive in it? Most people walk past their land and see limitation. But a seasoned grower sees something different, potential, because the soil beneath your feet is not dead, it is waiting. And once you understand how to work with it instead of against it, that bad soil begins to tell a very different story. Now I remember a conversation I had years ago with an older farmer, one of those men who did not say much, but when he did, you listened. He looked out over a rough patch of land, hard ground, scattered stones, the kind of place most people would not even bother planting. And he said something I never forgot. Good soil grows crops, but tough soil grows wisdom. That stayed with me. Because what he meant was simple. When soil is not perfect, it forces you to choose the right plants, the right strategies, the right mindset, and that is where abundance begins. You see, most beginner gardeners make one costly mistake. They try to force delicate crops into poor conditions. They plant trees that demand rich, deep, perfectly balanced soil, and when those trees struggle, they blame the land. But the truth is, they chose the wrong trees, because there are fruit trees, powerful, resilient trees, that were designed by nature to handle tough conditions. Trees that send roots deep into the earth, that adapt, that endure, that produce, even when the soil is not ideal. And once you plant those trees, everything starts to change. Your harvest becomes more reliable. Your grocery bill starts to shrink. Your yard slowly transforms into a source of food and confidence. Healthy soil, wealthy foods, health, strength, stability. Now here is something most people do not realize. Some of these trees actually improve the soil over time. Their roots break up compacted ground. Their leaves fall and feed the soil biology. Their presence begins to wake the soil up. It is quiet work, but it is powerful. And before long, what once looked like poor soil begins producing something that looks a lot like wealth. Now I want you to think about your own space for a moment. Maybe it is a backyard. Maybe it is a small patch of land. Maybe it is just a rough corner that nothing seems to grow in. That space is not your limitation. It is your starting point. And today, I am going to walk you through fruit trees, 13 of them, that most people overlook. Trees that do not demand perfect conditions. Trees that can handle poor soil, rocky ground, even neglect in the early stages. But once they are established, they give back, year after year, harvest after harvest, quietly building something most people spend their entire lives chasing: food security. Now before we go deeper, I want to ask you something simple. Where are you watching from? And what kind of soil do you have? Is it sandy, clay, rocky? Drop it in the comments. I read those, and it helps me guide you better, because once you understand your soil, you can choose the right trees. And when you choose the right trees, that is when the shift happens. Now let us start with one of the most overlooked fruit trees in North America, a tree that many people ignore, but old farmers knew better than to overlook: the mulberry. This is not a delicate tree. It does not demand rich soil. It does not need constant attention, and it does not complain when conditions are less than perfect. In fact, it thrives in poor, dry, even slightly neglected soil. Its roots grow deep and strong, searching, adapting, stabilizing, and once it takes hold, it produces heavily, sweet fruit, often in abundance, season after season. Now here is where it gets interesting. Mulberries grow fast, faster than most fruit trees, which means in a shorter amount of time, you are not just planting a tree, you are planting a future harvest. And for a working family trying to stretch their food budget, that matters. Because this is what wealthy food looks like. Food that does not just cost money. Food that saves money. Food that feeds people. Food that grows again next year without asking you to start over. And that is the difference between planting for hobby and planting for abundance. Now mulberries are just the beginning, because the next tree we are going to talk about is one that can handle drought, poor soil, and still produce something incredibly valuable. Because the next tree I want you to understand is one that many people overlook, yet it has quietly fed families in some of the harshest conditions on earth: the fig tree. Now, if you have never grown a fig before, you might assume it is delicate, soft, something that needs perfect care, but the truth is almost the opposite. Figs are survivors. They do not just tolerate poor soil, they expect it. In fact, when you plant a fig tree in rich, overly fertile soil, it often grows a lot of leaves, but produces less fruit. But put that same tree in tougher ground, rocky soil, dry patches, even areas where other trees struggle, and something interesting happens. It focuses. Instead of wasting energy on excess growth, it channels its strength into producing fruit, and that fruit is dense, sweet, and incredibly valuable. Now think about that for a moment. A tree that does not need perfect soil, a tree that produces high-energy food, a tree that can thrive where others fail. That is not just a plant, that is a strategy. That is how you begin to turn overlooked land into something productive. Healthy soil, wealthy foods, health, strength, stability. And here is something else worth knowing. Fig trees have strong, searching roots. They go where the water is. They find what they need. Which means even in dry or compacted soil, they have a way of establishing themselves over time. Now I have seen fig trees planted along fences, beside old buildings, even in narrow strips of land where nothing else seemed to grow, and yet, year after year, they produced, quietly, faithfully. That is the kind of tree you want working for you. Now let me ask you something. If you had a small space, maybe just along the side of your house or fence line, would you rather plant something that struggles every year, or something that adapts and produces with less effort? That is the shift we are making here. We are not chasing perfect conditions. We are choosing the right crops. Now the next tree I want to show you is one that brings both resilience and something even deeper, longevity, the olive tree. Now most people think of olives and imagine large groves somewhere far away, but what they do not realize is this. Olive trees are built for poor soil. They actually prefer it. Dry, rocky, well-drained ground. That is where they feel at home. In fact, if the soil is too rich, too wet, too heavy, olive trees struggle, but give them tough conditions, and they dig in. Their roots spread wide and deep, stabilizing themselves in ground that other plants would reject. And once established, they can live for decades, even generations. Think about that. You are not just planting for this season. You are planting something that could outlive you, something that could feed your family for years to come. That is what wealthy food really is. It is not just about what you harvest today. It is about what continues to produce tomorrow, and the year after that, and the year after that. Now olives themselves are powerful. They can be cured, stored, turned into oil. They carry calories, nutrients, and long shelf life. And in a world where grocery prices continue to rise, that kind of food matters more than ever. Now here is something I want you to notice. The trees we have talked about so far, they all share something in common. They do not fight the soil, they work with it. Mulberry, fig, olive, each one adapts, each one produces, each one turns limitation into opportunity. And that is the mindset shift most people never make. They see poor soil and think, it cannot grow much here. But a wise grower asks a different question. What grows well here? That one question changes everything. Because once you start planting according to your soil, your results begin to multiply. Now let us keep going. Because the next tree I want to introduce you to is one that not only tolerates poor soil, but actually helps rebuild it while it grows. And when you understand this one, you will begin to see how planting the right trees does not just give you food, it transforms the land itself. And this is where things begin to shift from simply growing food to actually restoring the land beneath your feet. Because the next tree I want to show you is one that does not just survive in poor soil, it partners with it, the black locust. Now, this is not a tree most people think of when they hear fruit trees, and that is exactly why it is so powerful to understand. Because if all you ever do is plant fruit trees without thinking about the soil, you are missing half the harvest. Black locust is what old farmers would call a builder. It grows in some of the worst soil you can imagine. Dry, depleted, compacted ground where most crops fail. But here is the key. It has the ability to pull nitrogen from the air and store it in the soil. In simple terms, it feeds the ground. And when the soil is fed, everything else begins to grow better. This is how poor soil starts becoming living soil. This is how land begins to wake up. Now imagine this for a moment. You plant a few black locust trees along the edge of your space, maybe along a fence line or a rough patch you have been ignoring. At first, it does not look like much. But beneath the surface, something powerful is happening. The soil biology begins to increase. Nutrients begin to build. The ground starts to soften, to breathe, to hold life again. And then, when you plant your fruit trees nearby, they do not struggle the same way. They grow stronger. They produce more. They tap into a system that is now working with them. That is not luck. That is strategy. Healthy soil, wealthy foods, health, strength, stability. Now this is something many traditional growers understood. If you study old farming systems, especially those influenced by natural methods, will notice they did not just plant for harvest, they planted for support. And when you combine trees that feed the soil with trees that feed your family, that is when abundance begins to stack. Now let us bring it back to fruit, because the next tree I want to show you is one that benefits greatly from this kind of setup, and it is one you have probably seen before, but never thought much about: the pear tree. Now pears do not always get the attention that apples do, but in many ways, they are tougher. They can tolerate heavier soils, even clay, where other fruit trees struggle. They do not demand perfect conditions, but give them just a little support, a bit of improved soil, some airflow, a good position, and they will reward you. Now here is what makes pears valuable for a working family. They store well, very well. Unlike some fruits that need to be eaten quickly, pears can be harvested, stored, and used over time. That means your harvest stretches further. And when your harvest stretches further, your dependence on the store begins to shrink. That is what we are building here, not just a garden, but a system that supports your life. Now I want you to picture something: a small backyard, maybe not perfect, maybe not rich soil. But now you have planted a mulberry, producing fast fruit, a fig, thriving in tough conditions, an olive, growing steady and long-term, a few support trees, quietly feeding the soil, and a pear, storing food for later use. That is not just planting. That is building resilience. That is how small spaces begin to produce big results. Now let me ask you something. How big is your growing space right now? Is it a backyard, a side yard, a few containers, or something larger? Drop it in the comments. Because no matter the size, the principle stays the same. The soil beneath your feet is potential, and when knowledge meets living soil, abundance appears. Now we are not done yet, because the next few trees I am going to show you are some of the most overlooked when it comes to poor soil. And yet, when planted correctly, they can produce some of the most valuable food you will ever grow. And now we come to a group of trees that many people have seen, but very few truly understand. Because these next trees do not just tolerate poor soil, they quietly excel in it. Let us start with one that old homesteads rarely went without: the plum tree. Now plums are interesting. They do not demand perfect soil structure, and many varieties can handle less than ideal conditions, especially slightly sandy, or even somewhat compacted ground. They are adaptable, and once established, they produce generously, sweet fruit, often in large quantities, sometimes more than a family can eat fresh, which means preserving, sharing, even selling. That is where income begins to enter the picture, because wealthy food is not just about feeding yourself. It is about creating options. Now, right alongside plums, there is another tree that deserves your attention: the persimmon. This one surprises people, because persimmon trees are incredibly forgiving. Poor soil? They will handle it. Dry conditions? They adapt. Neglect in the early stages? They keep going. And when they mature, they produce fruit that is rich, sweet, and full of nutrients. Now here is something powerful about persimmons. They often produce when other trees are done for the season, which means your harvest window extends. And when your harvest window extends, your food security increases. You are not depending on one short season anymore. You are building layers of provision: healthy soil, wealthy foods, health, strength, stability. Now let us go a step further, because if your soil leans more toward sandy or even slightly acidic, there is a tree that fits right into that environment: the pawpaw. Now not everyone is familiar with this one, but those who are, value it deeply. Pawpaw trees can grow in less than perfect soil, especially in a bit of shade in their early years. They are native to North America, which means they already understand the conditions. They are adapted. And the fruit, it is something special, soft, rich, almost tropical in flavor. But here is the key point. You are growing something unique, something that does not rely on long-distance shipping, something that does not sit on store shelves, losing quality. You are growing fresh, nutrient-dense food, right where you are. That is real value. Now I want you to notice something again. We have now talked about several trees: mulberry, fig, olive, pear, plum, persimmon, pawpaw, different types, different fruits, but all share one truth. They do not need perfect soil to produce. They just need the right placement, a bit of understanding, and time. And time is something most people underestimate. Because when you plant a tree, you are not just planting for today. You are planting for years of harvest, years of stability, years where your land begins to give back more than it takes. Now let me give you a simple comparison. One person looks at their poor soil and decides, nothing good will grow here, so they leave it empty. Another person takes that same soil, plants the right trees, learns a few principles, stays consistent, and a few years later, that same space is producing fruit, season after season. Same soil. Different outcome. The difference, knowledge. And once you have it, you cannot unsee the potential around you. Now we are coming into the final stretch, because there are still a few more trees I want to share with you, and these last ones, 8, tie everything together. They show you how even the most overlooked land can become one of the most valuable parts of your life. And now we bring it all together. Because the last group of trees I want to share with you, they carry something powerful in common. They finish what we started. They prove that even land most people ignore can become a steady source of food, strength, and stability. Let us begin with the apple tree. Now apples are well known, but often misunderstood. Many people assume apples require perfect soil to produce well. But the truth is, there are hardy varieties that can tolerate poor, even somewhat rocky or clay-heavy soil, especially when given time to establish. And once they do, they become one of the most dependable food sources you can plant. Apples can be eaten fresh, stored, dried, cooked. They stretch. And when food stretches, your money stretches. That is part of what makes this wealthy food. Now, right alongside apples, there is another tree that does not always get the attention it deserves: the cherry tree. Certain cherry varieties are surprisingly resilient. They can handle less than perfect soil, as long as drainage is reasonable. And once established, they produce something valuable, not just in nutrition, but in demand. Because cherries are one of those fruits people love. Which means if you ever decide to sell, you are not just growing food, you are growing opportunity. Now the final tree I want to leave with you is one that quietly stands strong in tough conditions: the quince. Not many people plant it today, but older growers knew its value. Quince trees can handle poor soil. They are tough, adaptable, and they produce fruit that stores well and can be transformed into jellies, preserves, and more. It is another example of a tree that does not just give you a harvest, it gives you options, and when you have options, you have stability. Healthy soil, wealthy foods, health, strength, stability. Now let us step back for a moment and look at the bigger picture. We started with an idea that most people overlook, that poor soil is not the end of the story. It is the beginning, because you have now seen that there are trees, many trees, that can grow, adapt, and produce even when conditions are not perfect. Mulberry, fig, olive, pear, plum, persimmon, pawpaw, apple, cherry, quince, each one playing a role, each one proving that abundance is not reserved for perfect land. It is created by the right choices. Now let me give you a simple picture. Two people standing on the same type of land, same soil, same conditions. The first person sees the hard ground, the rocks, the lack of richness, and decides it is not worth the effort. So nothing changes. Year after year, the land stays the same. No harvest, no growth, no return. But the second person learns just a little, chooses the right trees, plants with intention, gives it time. Slowly, something begins to happen. The trees take root, the soil begins to improve. The harvest starts small, then grows, A few fruits turn into baskets. Baskets turn into seasons of abundance. And over time, that same piece of land begins to produce food, reduce grocery costs, strengthen health, even create income. Same soil, different future. That is the power of knowledge. That is the power of working with the land instead of against it, because the soil beneath your feet is potential. And when you understand it, when you choose wisely, when you plant with purpose, it begins to give back in ways most people never experience. So, whether you have a large yard, a small backyard, or just a rough patch of ground that has been overlooked, do not underestimate it. Because that space, that simple piece of earth, may hold more opportunity than you ever imagined. And it all begins the moment you decide to plant. Remember, wealthy foods lead to health, strength, and peace of mind. Thank you for watching, and do not forget to subscribe for more practical wisdom and simple methods to help you grow abundance right where you are. Until next time, keep growing.